With all the success you've had, do you still face, are you currently facing any fears, or are there fears about the horizon?
I have to give you amazing props. You're such a curious person about the people that you talk to. I love it. I love it, man.
Thank you.
The answer is, thank you. Are you kidding me? I've been on a ton of podcasts and people just same questions.
Welcome to the Idea Climbing Radio Show. Today we're talking about how to bring your big idea to life through storytelling. And my guest is Robert Mattson. Robert works with companies and their people on how to use storytelling to be more intriguing, persuasive, and memorable. He teaches workshops, speaks at events, and works on messaging projects on how to take stories from creation to final delivery. He's a playwright, filmmaker, photographer, actor, singer, director, and a family man when he's not working. He's releasing his first book, The Salesperson's Guide to Storytelling, on February 4th of 2025. Thank you for making the time with all that going on, Robert. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Mark. It's absolutely a pleasure to be here.
And before we get into some of the strategies about storytelling and how to use it effectively, especially with big ideas, how did you get into storytelling to the point where you're writing a book on it, you're teaching it? What's your story about storytelling?
Well, there's actually kind of two phases of it. I think it really started when I was 15 years old, walking down my high school hallway and seeing an audition notice on the music room's wall, turning to my two friends saying, "Hey, we're auditioning for a musical today." And that started a kind of a lifelong affair with acting. And I've written 50 plus plays. I've been in more musicals than I care, and straight plays that I care to mention. And that was it. But then about coming up in 7 years ago, I was a VP of marketing for a software company. And when you're at a small software company and you have a few soft sales quarters, and I hadn't been there, I'd been there less than a year. Well, when sales goes soft, you get very easily turned from strategic leader to overpriced overhead. And I was out my own, and I had an opportunity to teach a kind of a storytelling workshop. I was asked to do it, and I found an epiphany. And I said, I have to try this full time. And this spring will be 7 years that I've been doing it. And I've been building up research and best practices and all those wonderful things to try to make sure that I am teaching people in a way that they can take storytelling elements and apply it to business.
As far as the storytelling elements go, what comes first? Where does a good story start?
Everywhere. You might seem like a cop-out answer, but it's absolutely true. See, stories are all around us. And the minute you start to realize how to build stories, you start seeing them everywhere. Whether it's leaving a coffee cup on top of your car as you drive off, to going to the Home Depot and looking for paint for a shed, suddenly all these themes start popping up because stories are the way that everyone communicates. And before written tradition, there was oral tradition. That's the way we're wired. We're wired for stories. So the question is not how do you find good stories? It's picking the right ones that are going to have the effect that you need.
So with getting the right effect, what makes a great story?
Well, I think the key element to making a great story is it serving the purpose you need? So if I tell you a story that is about 1940 Volvos and you're not interested in cars, it's not a great story potentially. But if I tell you a story that you have some interest in or you get something to gain out of it, well, that's the beginning. That's the foundation. Because if it's not a good fit for you, no matter how well I craft the story, no matter how dynamically I tell it, it's not going to connect. So it's looking at your audience and saying, okay, what's going to work for this particular audience? And then building a story using a good, solid foundation and using, dare I say, stagecraft to tell the story well. If you've ever been to a moth night, a storytelling night, there are great storytellers there, but some will land a little flat because they're not stories for me, but they're still told very, very well. So it's creation and then delivery. That's the most important aspect to look at.
How do you figure out what kind of stories would be a good fit? Because I imagine there's a lot of directions you can go with stories. How do you figure which ones are a good fit?
Okay, well, let's talk about the purpose of the story. Is the purpose of the story to entertain, to teach, or to persuade? If it's to entertain, Well, then I've got a whole bunch of information. I just have to make sure I deliver it well. It's interesting. It's funny. It's got a twist on it. That's pretty simple. If it's trying to persuade, I have to know what that person, where their stance is on a particular topic. And then will the story teach them something that is both interesting, but also compelling to get them to shift their viewpoint? And if I'm just teaching, well, I have to make sure it's clear. I have to elevate it and simplify. I tell people that to be a great communicator, there are 3 words that are key: selfish, lazy, and smug. I'm not saying you have to be any of those. I'm saying assume your audience is a little bit of each. They're selfish. They want something out of it. So the quicker you give them value, the more you're going to keep them connected with you. Because if you don't catch them at the beginning, it's really hard to get them back. So selfish, give them value quickly. Lazy, no one wants to do a bunch of math. If your story has a lot of complexity to it, that's not adding any kind of value, you're going to lose the crowd again. And smug, do you have credibility to pass along that message? I work a lot with salespeople. Now, if you walk in and you feel like you're being sold and you think that, hey, I'm a wallet with legs to you, then you are not really going to connect with that person. I tell salespeople when I work with them, I said, I'm going to give you a promotion. You're no longer a salesperson. You're an industry analyst with a quota. You are someone that has a lot of knowledge about your area of expertise, and your job is to share it. In fact, I tell people, give away as much value as you can. If you just start giving people value, trust me, if you have an hour with them, you're not going to give away the entire store. But you're going to show them that, one, you're more about their benefit than your own, and also that you're that industry analyst with a quota. You have knowledge that they can use.
When it comes to persuasion, I think that's a big one. When you have an idea, you're trying to get it across to somebody and, have them buy into it. Can you unpack persuasion a little bit more? What makes something persuasive in a good way and not a salesy way?
Authenticity, making sure that people know that you're trying to help them, and also not bragging. One of the big challenges that I see a lot with salespeople is they suffer from what I call the curse of knowledge. They know a lot about their product and their services and their company and even themselves, and they tend to just shove it out at people. What I want them to show is, how do you change my life? How does what you do make me better, easier, faster, whatever the benefit happens to be? So one thing I tell people, don't tell me stories about your product. Tell me stories about your customers that achieved greatness because you happen to be there. When I teach a workshop, I put up a picture of Luke Skywalker, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and a lightsaber, because most people know the original Star Wars from 1977, another great story. It's a classic example of the hero's journey. And if you haven't read Joseph Campbell's The Heroes with a Thousand Faces, read it. So I put that up and I say, who's the hero of Star Wars? And eventually people get down to Luke Skywalker. Then underneath each one, I put Luke, customer, Obi-Wan, vendor, lightsaber, product. If you're telling a story, don't try to make you or your product the hero. Let the customer be the hero, and you're the person, the catalyst of change that got them to achieve greatness. You're not Excalibur. You're not Merlin. You got to make sure that you're telling a story about King Arthur.
So what are some other examples of ways, when you mention, because that's a powerful word, when you say change somebody's life, or powerful phrase, what are some examples that you've seen, whether it's people you've trained or yourself? How do you create a life-changing experience or product? So
I want to take the grandeur out of that for a moment, because that's what scares people away from some of these concepts. They think, oh, it's life-changing. I have to, cure cancer, or I need to make the lame walk. Life-changing can be small, but it is something that is focused on them. It could be as simple as saving you $100 over the year on your electric bill, or making it easy for you to, get to the store. It can be small, but it's personal to you. So one example, I was dealing with a client of mine, and they have this really great technology where it's organizational psychology based. So when people are recruiting, what do? Well, you ask for a resume, right? That's the way people recruit. They need people, they ask for resumes. But they actually have a survey which people would take and tell their top strengths from their top one to their bottom, their 10th, let's say. And it's not what they necessarily do well, but it's what they enjoy the most. So if you're a great communicator and you enjoy communicating, great. If you're great at organizing, great. You go home and you have a great day organizing and you're very happy, versus if you do it well but don't enjoy it, not great. And then they have people, managers, fill out and say, what is the job going to need in the future? And then they match those up. So they need to convince people that it's not about a resume and a job history. It's about what you will be successful doing. The trouble is people are thinking about resumes when they recruit. So they need to get people to change that thinking. So here's what they did. We came up with a very simple story that they opened up every sales meeting with over the course of 18 months. And it was this: there are 50,000 car accidents every year in the United States when people are backing up, when they're looking in their rearview mirror. How many accidents do you think would happen if people drove forward looking in their rearview mirror? That's the way a lot of people are recruiting these days. They're trying to look at the past to figure out what they need in the future. I'd like to talk to you about something a little bit different. It's a 30 to 45-second story, but it gets people nodding in the right direction. And that's the beginning of persuasion, getting them thinking about something in a new way. But then you have to prove it. And that's where it can get a little bit more challenging to do it right.
How do you do it right? What does proving something look like?
Well, the first thing is making sure that you're giving them examples of not what you do, but how they benefit from it. And when you use examples, client stories, you don't tell them about Obi-Wan being the hero. You tell them stories about your clients being the hero. So as an example, I could tell a story about a company getting an advantage. Companies don't get advantages. People do. A person has to decide to buy a product or to change something, just like the person you're talking to. They're looking for someone who looks like them, that had success with whatever you do. So if I told a story about, let's say you are my person. I'm not going to tell a story about a company. I'm going to tell a story about Mark Carter. Now, Mark's a great guy. He's been at this company for 15 years. He's a real book guy. You do a Zoom call, all you see is books behind him. He's even written a book, as a matter of fact. But Mark had this problem. Mark was dealing with X, Y, and Z. Then Mark ended up chatting with us. Then Mark was able to accomplish A, B, and C. And Mark found these great advantages. And in fact, Mark found something that he didn't even expect. So the story is all about you. The product, vendor, whoever is telling the story is just a catalyst of change. Because when it comes down to it, every client story is really kind of a written reference call. Show me someone like me who had success with what you do, and make it feel like they're really close to my situation.
You had mentioned a hero's journey. I love that topic. Could you dive into that a little bit more? What is the hero's journey? Take us through that.
Well, Joseph Campbell wrote The Hero with 1,000 Faces, basically researched 1,500 stories throughout the world. And he came up with this kind of a standard process that most of these stories really lined up with. And I'll simplify it quite a bit, but the first thing is the world is normal. So everything's fine. World is normal. Something changes. The hero struggles. The mentor appears. The hero accepts the journey. So that is the kind of the archetype of a lot of hero stories. And you think of Star Wars, the world is normal. The droids come to Tatooine. They meet Luke, who is going to go off to the academy next year. So the world has changed. He sees the hologram of Leia. He knows something's happened. He goes and finds Ben Kenobi, the mentor. And then he decides, after his aunt and uncle get killed, that he is going to go off and become part of the rebellion. So that is both an example of the hero's journey, but also there's a 3-act structure. That's kind of the end of the first act, is when the hero has to make a decision to change. And that's when his aunt and uncle, the Imperials, actually killed them, and has nothing to lose. And he goes off with Ben Kenobi, meets Han and Chewie, and the rest of the story that most people know.
So you said that's the first part of the journey. I think if I heard you right, there's 3. Is it like chapters of the journey, or what does it look like after the change happens?
And almost every story that whether it's a Hollywood blockbuster or a bedtime story, there's a 3-act structure. So the first act is the introduction. It's setting the world of the story. You meet the main characters, you know where it's happening, you find out what the world is like. Then it comes to a point where the hero goes to the second act, which is kind of the meat of the story. It's called the conflict. That's where the hero and the protagonist and antagonist are going against each other. So that's when Luke goes to Alderaan, planet blows up, they get captured by the Death Star, they get the plans, Obi-Wan gets cut down, and they rescue Leia, and they take off. So that's the meat of the story. And the end is, how do you resolve it all? This is when they attack the Death Star. Luke he uses the Force, and the torpedo goes down into the chute, explosion, metals. So that's the 3-act. You're introducing the concept, then you are doing the meat of the story, what happens, and then you are doing some kind of resolution. In business, same structure. But what I tell people is you still have to do an intro, but you have to do it in an intriguing way. Because unlike a movie, they didn't pay $16 to see your story. So you have to give them value quickly. Then in the conflict, it's more about persuasion. What are the challenges that the hero overcomes? But it's usually your hero and your product is what enables them to do it. And you get to show them that information and usually tell a bunch of client stories. And then there's the resolution. And there's good things you can do in your resolution. The last thing I tell people to do is, you've been in a bunch of meetings, and one of the things you probably hear is like, okay, I'd like to close with questions. Now, people tend to remember the end of meetings really, really well. There are brain reasons for it, the way the brain works, but they tend to remember things at the end really well. If you end with questions and you don't answer the last one well, what is the impression you've given people?
That's a bad impression.
Yeah. So questions near the end, fine. Questions at the end, please don't. Have something at the end. And usually I phrase it as, oh, one last thing I want to leave you with. And you can tell a story, show a visual, do a drawing, share an anecdote, something. I love leaving physical things with people because then they remember who you are every time they look at it. Or I've done things where I put a drawing on a board and I've come back 6 months later and seen the drawing outline saying, do not erase. So you want to close with something that has impact. And usually at the end, you want to close with something that either overcomes an objection or reinforces a strength, because that will help you in a sales world to get to the next meeting.
Well, as far as meetings with people, presentations and otherwise, could you dive in a little bit more about how do you keep their attention? Let's assume, okay, you got their attention, great, out of the gates. How do you keep it? Because I've been in meetings where it starts out good and then it's like, oh my God, I just want to go. I want to leave. How do you keep someone's attention once you get it?
Well, there are two elements of it. And are you familiar with Russian dolls, the ones with the doll inside a doll inside a doll?
The nesting dolls.
Yes, nesting dolls, Marushka dolls, I think they're called. So think of your big arc of a story like the big doll. Inside it is a whole bunch of other dolls. So the key is to keep on bringing change into it. So if you have a big story arc, you can have little stories throughout that arc. And every time you give someone something to evaluate, their brain, it wakes up a little bit. In fact, if you don't give someone something new, their brain tends to kind of fall asleep. Their hippocampus is not being used, which is kind of your fight or flight. So the key is, how can you bring in change? Again, making it interesting for them, something that they are selfish about, that they would find interesting. But it can be physical change. If you are live in a room or you're doing a big speech, are you walking the stage with purpose? Are you creating virtual elements on the stage? I tell people that hand gestures are your most powerful tool because you can create virtual objects on a stage. Left hand down is bad. Up hand right is good. And every time I point down to the left, they know I mean bad. I can create a rocket ship coming up in the back of the room. I can have a dinosaur walking across stage. I can use all of the physical acting skills to get people to imagine things. And it gives you an unlimited number of options. So by using that theatricality, and some people it comes naturally, some people it doesn't, but you can use elements of it by just holding up a pencil and saying, hey, this your process is as easy to break as this pencil. And then you have the shards of the pencil to talk about, is this where you want to go with a broken process? You could do something like that. So the key is to keep things moving, keep things changing, make sure that you're using every tool that you have, whether it's a new story, a story with a twist, or it's some kind of physical performance skill, some stagecraft that you can use. Now, if you're doing a sales meeting or a status meeting, sales meetings are more theatrical than status meetings, but even status meetings. Let's say we are working on a project and I'm supposed to give you an update on a spreadsheet. Before I do it, I can say, hey, before we jump into all the numbers, I want to thank Reggie because Reggie was working all last night trying to get these together because there were some changes that were really important. And I just want to thank him. So I brought a human element in. Now this spreadsheet has more value. Also, I've hinted that there are important changes that someone stayed up all night to make sure they got in here. So I've foreshadowed important things to come. These are all little techniques that you can use to get people leaning in. In fact, one of the great examples, if you've ever gone to the theater and seen an actor lower their volume and watch the audience, if you want to get my attention, don't yell, lower your volume. And the audience will naturally lean in because they know something important is happening. So there are all of those different things. And that's why it's a 2-day workshop with like 4 hours on just that.
Oh my gosh. How do you know when to close a story and not go overboard and make it too long? Because I'd imagine that plays into it. Once you get their attention, lose it with the too long of a story. How do you know when the time comes to close a story and close strong?
Well, yes, I call it being a ramble fest. And there are a lot of ramble fests out there. And people actually know there are people that's just their tendency. And they know that they're ramble fests. The key is detail versus brevity. You're always trying to edit your story down to the shortest amount of time you can use with the amount of detail that makes it feel real. The problem is not writing a story. The problem is editing it. So if you're going to use some story elements, get up in a room and invite someone to listen to the story and say, how did that affect you? What did you learn from it? Don't ask them how to improve it. Because you don't want someone rewriting your story. You want someone acting as an audience and telling you what they got out of it. There are too many people that will want to rewrite your stories. And some of them will have good advice, but a lot of them won't. But every time someone tells you what they got out of it, it is valid advice. Because that is the true purpose of your story. Not just to tell it, but for it to have purpose.
So how do you know what to keep in and what to leave out when you're editing your own story?
There are a number of ways to go about that. One way is to tell it and to see what works, to watch the audience's body language. If you're going for a laugh and the laugh doesn't come, don't immediately assume the joke's not good because you might just have an audience that's not connecting with it. But if it doesn't go well the next time, then you know you got a definite way of doing it. And the thing is, the more you do that, the more you can actually just record it and listen to it and go, yeah, that's not going to fly. The thing is, you have to get out of presenter mode and into listener mode. So recording is a great way. And also asking for that feedback from people is a great thing. Eventually, when you read it, you will see some of the weaknesses. Not all, but you'll see some.
And if someone's watching right now and they're thinking, a lot of what we're talking about makes sense, but I'm a newbie to storytelling. Where do you tell the people to, because there's so much you could do. Where do people even get started if they say, I know I need to be a better storyteller and I'm amateur at storytelling? What advice do you have for those people to get started?
There are a lot of resources out there. One thing is in almost every city, every major city, there's a moth night. So moth nights are storytelling nights. Go to one. See how people tell stories. Do a little research. Just Google storytelling. How do I tell a great story? You'll come up with a lot of the standards that you can do. But knowing the rules is different than knowing how to do it well. Mm-hmm. So after you see good examples, after you study some of the structures, then you have to get up and do it and see what works and what doesn't. the only thing that's going to make you better is practice. And I'll give one piece of advice. Don't be afraid of silence. Great storytellers use silence. Bad storytellers fear it. Because if you listened, in my workshop, I actually show the first 90 seconds. It's a sound wave of MLK's "I Have a Dream" speech, and you could see the pauses that MLK used as a great orator. Every presentation is a conversation. It's just that the audience is responding quietly. They need time to listen, to react, to think. And great speakers give them those breaths, those moments to make sure that they are reacting. And when you do that, you can feel it. The biggest thing of an audience is when you have a good one, because you can feel the energy coming back. I've done shows where we've done the same show the night before that was great, and the same show this night, same script, same actors, same everything, and it went dead because the audience just wasn't giving us anything back. And we had to work 3 times as hard and put so much energy into it. We were exhausted by the end of the night. After the first night with a great audience, we went out dancing.
Nice. You touched on it a little bit. Could you dive into what are some of you mentioned the rules. What are some of the rules of storytelling?
Well, the rules of storytelling is knowing what your goals are and there's so many rules. There's so many guidelines. I shouldn't say rules. There's so many guidelines. The first thing is, to me, when I tell a story, is I need to know who the audience is and what I'm trying to get out of them. That's rule number 1. The next thing, I need to know what environment am I in? What's acceptable for this story? If I'm in a work environment, I know I have to keep a story that's a little bit more tame. I need to keep the structure of it and the content a little more tame. If it's a bunch of people out on a night in the town, you can have a little bit more fun. You can go more wide ranging. And the other thing is making sure you're watching the audience during it. Because the great thing about telling a story is that you can shift gears quickly. But if you're not reading your audience, you don't know when to shift. I've done stories where I'm thinking, oh, this is a great story, a lot of great detail, and the audience is just not connecting with me. I'm like, this is not their story. And I cut it down quite heavily to something that was a lot tighter to get through the story. Did I tell a story? Yes. Did they get what I needed for them to get out of it? Yes. But they weren't going to be invested into all the details of it because it wasn't meant for them. So, I mean, knowing your environment, knowing what your goal is, and reading the audience and reacting to it, I think if people walk away with that, they would get a lot better stories out of it.
If your audience is one person, what are some things as far as reading your audience, like you just said, if it's one person, you're trying to get an idea across, persuasion plays a role in it. What kind of things should you be watching for with that other person to know when you need to shift gears or keep going?
They're going to give you signs. There's body language signs. There is active listening signs they're going to give you. There's also energy. You can tell when someone's energized by a story. They're going to be smiling. Their eyes are going to light up. They're going to feel that. You're trying to read them as they go. If you're in a sales situation, let's say you're pitching them on an idea, and maybe it's just trying to convince them to go your way, whether versus buying something, but it's still sales. Mm-hmm. I try to make the sales call or presentation into a working session as much as possible. Get them to participate in your story. That's why one of the things I love drawing so much during my stories, because my favorite thing in the world is when the person grabs the pen from me and starts saying, oh, no, that's not the way it works here. And they start drawing, because I've changed it from me presenting a story to them contributing to the story. So it's how much are you seeing them involved in their body, their facial, their vocals, and their actions. If you are one-on-one, if they're giving you that, you know you're in good shape.
You mentioned the word engaging. I'd love to learn more about that. What makes an engaging story so you can actually get the audience's attention?
I think in general, you got to start with work. You have to do the work. I know a lot of people that have a lot of great stories, but the minute they tell them, they've shot that. They can't use that again with the same audience. So when you're walking in, what are you bringing that's new? And what are you doing that's inventive for this audience? It's kind of like being a tailor. You want to make it custom fit to them. So what will they find value in? And what will they find interesting? And what is something that they haven't heard before? A lot of people will go in and say, oh, I'm going to tell the story based upon this statistic. Like, haven't they heard that before? I'll give you an example. Most people in business have heard about the Ford Model T and the assembly line.
Mm-hmm.
So in 1913, Henry Ford created the first assembly line for automotive construction. And everyone knows about the Model T. It was the car that got everyone in the U.S., or a lot of people in the U.S., to have their first car. You could have it in any color you want as long as it's black. These are stats that a lot of people know. I have a slide that I use in a workshop, and it's a picture of a black Ford from the beginning of the century. And I asked people, I said, what is this? And most people was like, that's a Model T. I say, hey, the interesting thing, it's not. It's a Model N. Now, the assembly line happened in 1913. The Model N came out in 1906. So how did they build the Model N until the assembly line came out with the Model T? Well, what they did is they had a sled made of wooden slats that they would put the chassis on, and men would drag it from position to position. And I tell people, a lot of people think that they have a Model T on an assembly line, when really they have a Model N on a bunch of slats that they're dragging from place to place. And I'm using that example, that story, to teach people that they might think they have something, but they don't. So I researched the Model N story when I had that question in my mind. What happened before the assembly line, and were there cars? So I had a curiosity moment. I found a story, and I said, this is a perfect example for a particular use. And whenever I tell that story, I never had anyone say, I've heard that before, because it's not common. So the key is to do the work, come up with something that is uniquely yours, and that will capture people's attention.
What are some ways, a big part of storytelling, and especially in the business world, you're persuading, even educating, you want people to retell your story. How do you make a story memorable so someone can share your story with their friends and you can even reach an even wider audience? What makes a memorable, if it's even a word, retellable story?
Well, the great thing is the structure itself makes it retellable. Stories are 22 times more memorable than features facts alone. So you might only remember for an hour or two if I give you a fact, but if I tell you a story, you'll retain that for probably a week at least. And what are you going to do in that week? You're going to talk to people. So the structure itself will give you a huge edge. But the key is how clean, and when I say clean, I don't mean in content, but how streamlined is your story, and how do you have elements? The human brain remembers two things really, really well: visuals and emotion. So if you have a strong visual aspect of it and you have an emotional connection to it, people will remember it more likely. The example is, if you have children, you probably remember the day a child is born, even though it might be 10, 20, 30 years ago. But you won't remember what you had for lunch 2 weeks ago on Tuesday, because the brain will keep the emotional stories higher in its stack for people to retell. So by adding an emotional aspect of it, maybe it's even phrases like, it was so frustrating. It was an incredibly arduous journey that we took to get from stage 1 to stage 2. Using those phrases and visuals. And if I can't draw you something or show you a picture or hand you a physical object, I'm going to use visual language. I'm going to use descriptive language. You're supercharging the memory by putting a story in and adding emotional and more visual, concrete elements. When people get very academic and they don't have concrete examples, it's really hard to remember things. But the minute you get into those concrete examples, it locks it in the brain. So structure, visuals, emotional, bang. You've got something that people will remember and talk about long after you've left the room.
You use this word a couple times, and it's Interesting. I'd like to learn more about when you say a clean story, not the language, but a clean story. What makes a clean story? I don't think I've heard that before.
It's that detail versus brevity. So think about modern architecture. So if you went Victorian or Baroque, things like that, there's a lot of detail in that, lots of little curves and feathers and things like that. If you go mid-century modern, it's streamlined. There's not a lot of extra in there that's not needed for the foundation. Like a shaker cabinet, for instance, is another example of a clean design. So what you're trying to do is saying, what is necessary in this story that has it hold together and tells the story well without something? So if I told you a story and I added a bit about my father going to a certificate school because he was an electrician, that's great. If I added more to that about how he drove from Maynard to Boston, it's not important to the story. It's just that he went and got a certificate to become an electrician. So it's deleting those things. That's when it comes down to editing. You want to get rid of the things that aren't helping. So clean up the story, get rid of the superfluous stuff, and get it down to the part where it is something that is just really compact and able to be understood well.
How do you know what's necessary? I mean, that's a broad statement as far as keeping things in, leaving them out. How do you know what is necessary to keep in the story?
Two ways. One way, if you're doing it on your own, is to say, what is my main point? So if I told you a story about my dad in a certificate program, let's say my point is about someone who is is driving his own future, is in control of his own future. So the important thing is that he went to Boston to get a certificate so he could get the job he wanted. What route he took to get to Wentworth, where he got a certificate, that could be good in another story, but not this one. It doesn't matter where he drove. If I was telling a story about the shortest distance between 2 points and how not to get distracted, then I might use that detail. So the first thing to know is, what am I trying to get to? And are these elements of my story supporting that element? And the other thing is, again, tell the story, see what lands, and then get rid of the stuff that doesn't.
And we have covered a lot of ground in a relatively short period of time. A big question with a quick answer. As far as people watching saying, okay, I get storytelling. We've covered a lot of stuff. I know I need to be a better storyteller. I've probably even heard it before. Now I'm going to actively do this. If you were to say, when it comes to storytelling, at least do this one thing, at least get this right, what would you tell people to do with storytelling for that one thing above all else?
Well, there's one thing for prep. And so I'm going to give you one thing to prep for it. And I'll give you another thing to when you're actually creating your story. The first thing is, if you want to prep for it, take an improv class. Get comfortable shifting on your feet. I recommend to everyone in this world to take an improv class. It's going to help you. The other thing, there's a phrase in writing about, it's kind of graphic, so I apologize. It's like, you can't be afraid to kill your babies. And that means you can't be afraid to cut things that you love. So if you have a story, don't fall in love with any element of it and say, I'm not getting rid of this. If it's not going to work, if it's not working, you're going to have to get rid of it. So don't fall in love with a particular phrase or a particular piece of your story or a particular motion on stage. If it doesn't work, get rid of it. Don't have too much pride in your own work if it's not effective for you.
This has been excellent. If people want to find you online, where's the best place or places to go?
You can go to intrigue.cc. That's no.com, just intrigue.cc. Or you can find me on LinkedIn. I tend to post things about storytelling, about business, about the way that I view the world on a fairly regular basis. But I always try to make sure that anything I post has something that people can use in a lesson that they can learn. That's my goal in everything.
Thank you so much, Robert. This has been awesome.
Thanks, Mark. Absolutely my pleasure.
And scene. Thank you for tuning into the Idea Climbing radio show today. I really appreciate it. I hope you got something great out of it that you can take into your own life and use to be better in your own life. If you want more great shows like this, go to 216thenet.com. You want to see more of my interviews, radio show, and podcast? Go to markjcartertv.com. Again, that's markjcartertv.com and 216thenet.com. Hope to see you on one of those platforms or maybe even both.